So hello philea, ciao. Hola, I wish you had been a bit more boring. This is going to be a hard act to follow, but I will start by saying I was actually quite surprised that Philea invited me because I've been known to say some provocative things about philanthropy, not to dismiss it, but to be a bit of a thorn in the side, including things like the mafia, La Cosa Nostra, was actually born out of philanthropy. When you have weak states, then you end up with self-help and mutualistic organizations, La Società dei Beati Paoli in Sicily. And this is really the point. How can we make sure that philanthropy is part of the solution and not part of the problem? So when we have weak states, which doesn't mean small states or big states, but incapable states, not working for people and planet, as we heard in the beginning, when we have businesses that are just maximizing their shares and extracting, not paying their taxes, and with those excess rents, setting up foundations, using 7 trillion, that's the number, in the last 10 years, just to buy back shares to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. When we have finance, this just financing itself, in my own country, in the UK, 80% of finance goes back to finance, insurance, and real estate. Conveniently, the acronym is FIRE. So not only the climate is on fire, but finance as well. Well, then, of course, we'll need philanthropy to fill the gaps, right? The so called financial gaps. I do have like 1,000 slides, so at some point I should click this. But anyway, and so really, this is my one kind of line takeaway. I don't like business schools that do takeaways, but I will say it now. The takeaway is let's stop filling the gap. Let's really restructure how the economy works. And philanthropy has a huge role in doing that. But to do that, it's not just about taking more risk. That always sounds good, but I'm like, for what? Risky what? Right? How do you actually really become a thorn in the side of a system that is not working? And up until now, perhaps with a bit of mea culpa, you've been part of the problem. Not you, personally, but this sector, right? So last year, I think it was 2.4 trillion was given out from different philanthropies. And this is, of course, a year and a decade and 2 decades in which the 1% have gotten more and more income. So obviously, these two things are also going hand in hand. How can we structure an economy in a pre-distributive way where all the different contracts and relationships between capital and labor, between public and private actors, between the state and different civil society organizations are done right from the start? And of course, if something then is not done at the end, we must, of course, fill that gap. But we are currently creating that gap by actually having the wrong kind of government, the wrong kind of business, the wrong kind of civil society institutions that themselves are often not necessarily providing that role of making sure that we increase the capacity on the ground in our own governments. And so, yes, we can look at the different data. And Ola, thank you for reminding us that the data is not so bad, but it is true. We have lots of inertia on all the different problems we care about here: water, biodiversity, health, and the relationships, by the way, between climate, biodiversity, and water is a very important point, which often is not thought about when we all have our siloed projects. But what I've been arguing for a very long time is that this is not by coincidence. It's by design. We've designed inertia in the system. And I like what you said, Ola, because when we care about problems, we know how to solve them. When we don't care, we just end up fixing things ex post. So literally, we have designed a whole economic apparatus, and yes, I'm an economist, that has actually built this reactiveness, this fixing things after the fact into the way we even think about the state. So it's no longer the state should get out of the way, right? It's no longer the Thatcher Reagan years. We have states, we have public funding for this, that, and the other. But as long as we have governments, whether it's local, regional, national, or global, that are thinking of their role as just fixing a market failure, it's not surprising then that we get this very boring language of, 7 trillion in a financial gap, as though there's a hole to fill for the sustainable development goals. And it's not that the market failures aren't there, of course they are, but if we see the the need to actually fix those problems, literally as putting bandages here and there, of course, will have an issue, as opposed to what? Actually shaping the structures on the ground and not fixing them constantly. And that really requires a whole different way of thinking of the civil service itself, which I'll come back to later. So government isn't in fixing mode. Business, as I said, corporate governance, I think, is stuck in many companies, not all. There's lots of different ways to do capitalism. But the fact that, as I mentioned, 7 trillion, that's a lot of money, over the last 10 years has just been used to buy back shares is, of course, a symptom. It's not the problem, it's a symptom of the problem. And how do we actually do this beautiful word of stakeholder value, right, in a way that actually creates value differently instead of creating value and then fixing it later, whether it's through philanthropy, whether it's through corporate social responsibility or ESG metrics that are not embedded in how value is created between business and the different actors that it works with. And as I mentioned, finance itself. There's plenty of finance out there. The problem is not the lack of finance. We have plenty of impatient finance, for example. There's not enough patient long-term finance. And when we do have it, for example, through the multilateral development banks or from national development banks, it's just so project specific. There's something like 23 trillion in the national, not multilateral, national development banking system. And it's just not like the sum is not bigger than the parts. So I'll come back to that. How do we actually structure finance? In fact, to be more mission oriented, outcomes oriented, but also admit that in so many different countries, finance itself is actually just financing different parts of this kind of extractive economy where real estate, for example, itself has become an asset to be bought and sold instead of seeing housing as a human right. And in this context, it's not surprising that labor's share of global income, people always talk about GDP as not being good enough. Just look at basic GDP figures. You see this data. The labor share of global income is at one of the lowest levels it's been in the history of capitalism. The capital share is at a very high level. And interestingly, the investment share has been falling. So we have lots of companies that are making high profits without actually investing. So all these things are actually related. It would take me a very long time to kind of go into them, but this was sort of the snapshot. And it's not about painting a gloom and doom thing where everything's going bad. Of course not. But it is also admitting that when we care about things, whether it's during a war or during the health pandemic, when lots of things happen quite quickly, we see what the power is of actually working together in an outcomes oriented way. And I've written a lot about this, like missions. What does that mean to have a mission oriented economy? How along the way do we debunk this idea that wealth is created only in the private sector and fixed in the public sector? So the history of Silicon Valley would not have happened if the state had just been fixing everything in your iPhones, internet, GPS, touchscreen. Siri actually came from a investor of first resort, not lender of last resort type of public organization of the DARPA type in Silicon Valley. And that story just hasn't really resonated in terms of really making sure it lands with a new theory of value, collective value creation. So what I want to talk about today is really, in my last 7 minutes or so, what it actually means then, starting from what I began with, of thinking of philanthropy as part of the economy, as one of the key actors, actually, that's going to help us do good, right? Because we all talk about doing good. The Sustainable Development Goals are good goals. But because of this inertia, because we have not actually been achieving them on time, and along the way, a lot of good washing, what would it look like to actually take that good out of just correcting, whether it's for a market failure, a government failure, or any sort of failure, but really putting good at the center of contracts, intellectual property rights, water rights, procurement, which is my obsession because 20% of many governments' budgets are just buying things. How are we buying things? What are we doing along the way to buying, whether it's school lunch or building our motorways? So how do we think of all the contracts, incentives, guarantees, bailouts during COVID as opportunities to really catalyze action, bottom up, not top down, but with a strong direction? And the latest book, which is not out yet, in fact, Margaret here has the first copy, so I have a couple of the hard copies delivered. It's coming out in a month. What does it mean to actually be inspired by a common good that goes beyond the notion of the public good as fixing a market failure. Here's the QR code, quick, before I move on. And to me, this is quite important, not only because Pope Francis inspired me quite a bit. And here he was saying, Mariana, come on, un poco de religión, un poco, because he knew I wasn't too religious. And I said, but yes, I'm very spiritual. And we talked about how he, more than so many economists, was serious about the common good. He had principles, the principle of subsidiarity, which means take the lessons from the lived experience at the local level to design those improved health policies. Listen, work with the Amazon and indigenous community in Brazil instead of just working for them through the Amazon Fund. The principle of the preferential option for the poor. Consider any policy you do and how it's going to affect the most vulnerable people. But this is not really grounded in any sort of economics. And so even though there's really interesting things happening globally where we can say there's some common good principles, they don't scale. The sum, again, is not bigger than the parts. We end up not getting transformation. We all end up having our cute little projects where something really interesting happened at the community level, or even with a big innovation collaboration, as is happening today in South Africa with the mRNA hub, learning from the failures of what we did during COVID. But it doesn't scale. It doesn't become a new way of doing capitalism. And this is really the key. Capitalism and the economy itself is an outcome of decisions we make and how we structure all these different types of relationships. There's no economic pressures and forces out there that are independent from the choices we make. And so in the book, what I do is turn this into sort of a compass. How can we learn not only from early social Catholic teaching, which again has really interesting principles, as do many religions, by the way, much more than the economists have, but actually start structuring a bit in a way that's as inspiring as what Aristotle to Sandel in political philosophy did, where there's a telos in Aristotle, the goal, but also the polis, not the police, the polis, the community, right? So how we build community, how we value each other, how we treat each other with dignity in the relationships, in the contracts, but also in the room, the vibe, the respect matters as much as what we are trying to do. And so I broke it down into this compass with these 5 elements, right, to help us navigate the world while we're, in theory, trying to do good, precisely to prevent that kind of common good washing. So the first is purpose and directionality. We need to be very clear. What are we even trying to do? And can we catch ourselves along the way if we're just bullshitting, blah, 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 which is what, of course, the teenagers, she's no longer a teenager, but Greta Thunberg said, right? We were just blah, 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 blah. What are you actually trying to do? And if you're failing, admit it and shift course. But then who decides the purpose and directionality, the mission? How can we make sure it's co-created, not just using that word as a slogan, but truly co-created, especially coming back to the point that the people with the lived experience on the ground who've been failed along the way, their voices should be brought to the table to govern the system in the future. And my own experience, for example, in Camden, where I live, in London, we worked through a commission, a renewal commission for Camden during the COVID pandemic. And one of the most interesting things was to bring the carers and the carees, people receiving the care, to the table ultimately to actually design what we call the mission-oriented procurement strategy for adult social care. And again, procurement, don't forget, it's such a big tool that every government has, often 20% of their budget. We wouldn't have gotten to the moon in the 1960s had NASA not said, let's start by just changing how we actually procure. And they ended up working with 400,000 people in the private sector to procure solutions to how would the astronauts go to the bathroom? What would they wear? What would they eat? We got how do you call it? Solutions and innovations like camera phones, foil blankets, baby formula, software. No one worried about innovation. No one talked about innovation. They had problems to solve, and NASA changed the procurement in order to deliver that. And they realized it was like a paperwork issue. They said the moon's easy, the paperwork will end up getting in the way. But they structured those public-private relationships in such a way that was, again, outcomes oriented. And they realized that they also had to put in the contracts no excess profits. In other words, yes, you can make profits along the way. That's important for business, but we're doing this together. Let's not turn this into a gambling machine. Collective learning and knowledge sharing, really, really important for making sure that, again, we don't repeat the mistakes we made in COVID. Only one of the vaccines, the so-called AstraZeneca one. It's actually Vaxrevia vaccine. It was a collaboration between Oxford University and AstraZeneca, and the publicly taxpayer-funded researchers at Oxford said, you know what? Since the goal is not the vaccine itself, but it's making sure that everyone in the world has access to the vaccine, how we produce it is going to really matter. And so let's make sure we share the knowledge, keep costs and prices low. And that went into the way that the actual innovation collaboration was structured from the start, instead of structuring it badly and then sending over expired vaccines to the global south through some sort of a philanthropic and charitable giving of the companies or of countries. So really embedding collective learning and knowledge creation in 21st century capitalism in how we actually collaborate from the start. Access for all and reward sharing. What's the point in doing any of these things, having a purpose, co-creating, and so on, if then the benefits are privatized? And this is really what happened in Silicon Valley. We socialized the risks and privatized the rewards. So what can we learn from good examples of where, again, in the contracts from the beginning, we have this notion that let's make sure that the benefits of this amazing collective value creation is shared as much as the risks taken. And really interesting examples that I've worked on recently, including informing Gina Raimondo when she was Secretary of Commerce for Biden, to make sure that learning, again, from the Silicon Valley lesson, that the so-called CHIPS Act, which was giving over $400 billion in grants, subsidies, and loans to semiconductor companies to build sovereignty, was built with contracts that made sure that that kind of benefit sharing was embedded. So no share buybacks. That's kind of just obvious. If you're getting money from government, reinvest it back into production, improve working conditions and worker pay, and use energy efficient supply chains. And again, that's just one example, different ways that you can embed from the start ways to think about benefit sharing. And lastly, transparency and accountability. Unless we actually know what's happening, who's earning what and why, who's doing what and why, it's actually impossible to do any of this. And one of the things I really focused on in the book, The Big Con, was that this ultra consultification of our governments has really been part of the problem, the outsourcing of capacity, which then brings in all these intermediators, including some of ourselves, whether it's academics, consultants, advisors, which is fine. Governments shouldn't be able to do everything. But when you have this massive outsourcing, the transparency of who's actually doing what and full of conflicts of interest, and the book was actually on kind of the McKinseyfication of our civil service, becomes a huge problem. So transparency is also, of course, about data, but also really about making sure that we have a capable, on the ground civil service that's able to govern some of the wicked problems of our time, so that when you, as a philanthropist, are working with governments, when you have public and private partnerships, they are actually good partnerships, and we know what's in the partnership. It was interesting that the head of procurement, Ernest Brackett, for NASA, he actually said, because at the time there was all the consultants already coming into NASA in the 60s. McKinsey was actually founded in the 20s. He said, if we keep doing this, we won't even know how to work with the private sector. And we have to work with the private sector. We won't know how to write the terms of reference. We won't understand space if we're not investing in our own brains. So that idea of a really decentralized network of different actors working together with real collective intelligence in a mission-oriented way. I haven't even gone through the slides on purpose because I knew that would bring me over. But if you're interested, we can continue talking about this later in the session. But what a mission-oriented approach ultimately requires is philanthropists, of course, at the table, but working with and not filling the gaps of making sure that we end up having a non-extractive business, a non-reactive government, civil society, and the lived experience at the table, where we're learning the lessons of what works and what doesn't, and ultimately also admitting that sometimes the mafia indeed is still there, just in terms of the corruption, the conflicts of interest, where philanthropy itself, because it actually hasn't been part of the solution to these problems that I've been talking about, really needs to also rethink its own role. So I will stop here. I feel bad for the next person because they're going to have to move forward about 30 slides that I didn't go through. I just thought that giving you really this idea that we need a compass in order to stop repeating the same mistakes and not use common good washing, but actually have a framework that helps us navigate these very positive moments in history, as Ola told us, but where actually inertia is absolutely there. And I hope I've helped you think a bit about that. Thank you so much.